Well, it's a real kick to be here tonight. I've been back once or twice to the house. We have, part of my story is that we were called houseboys in those days. We lived upstairs and downstairs. Upstairs is where you got to start, and when you got to be a senior, you might graduate to the nicer apartments downstairs. Anyway, four of my friends and colleagues from those days, we've all been married for 50 years to our spouses, and we get together every 2 years. So going back 58 years ago, we have remained in contact, very, very good friends. So that's a part of the history. I started my college career, I grew up in Milwaukee, northern suburbs, and I think it was 1957 that UWM began. And it was just a 2-year curriculum in those days. And so I started there. We didn't have a lot of money in my family system, so I could stay at home. And we had scholarships in those days, which were a whole $100, which was the tuition for a semester in those days. Can you believe that? When I heard about St. Francis House, where I could come and live free, wow! I naturally decided to come here, and then working at Liz Waters, a number of us were at Liz Waters. Is that still existing, the girls' dormitory? So that was kind of cool. I got to be there for breakfast and for dinner as a busboy. They called me Crash after working myself up from pots and pans. I was so proud. I got to be a busboy my first day out. So that name stuck with me for quite a few years. But anyway, we had all of our expenses paid. And then at lunchtime in the wintertime, on the windowsill upstairs, I used to keep a loaf of bread, some peanut butter and jelly. So that was my lunchtime in those days. And I think we used a fridge downstairs maybe during other parts of the year. Anyway, I came here in 1958, and St. Francis House became for me a place to grow up. I was emotionally not, well, I'm probably still not totally emotionally mature. But in those days, there was a lot of work to be done yet on me. And I came with that sense of having to have a big ego, or have ego. In other words, somehow I have a standing amongst my peers. So I went through a lot of stuff while I was here. And the community of people that were here, these were the days of Gerald White, Father White, and Mrs. Otto. So many of you know who those people are, and some of you don't know who they were. Gerald White was a Canadian from one of the eastern provinces. And he was a fairly quiet man, and he did preach long sermons, as one of the people said on the videos that I watched coming over here today. And I think he was a Rhodes Scholar. He was a very bright guy. And I think he was a widower. I think his wife had died previous to his coming here. So I think part of his being here was that. And Mrs. Otto, the same thing. She was a widow, so they were a good match. Mrs. Otto had the apartment up here, and Father White was in the office. I'm not too sure exactly where he lived. Anyway, they were important, and then my colleagues here in the house were important, plus my friends on campus. So it was a place really to discover who I was and what I was destined for in my life. What did God intend for me to do with my life? So my stories are a little more personal. I was finally ordained here in the diocese, and I served my first 10 years in the diocese in Racine at St. Luke's, where we started one of the first coffee houses in the Episcopal Church, and at St. Stephen's, which doesn't exist anymore, in the inner city, doing all the civil rights stuff that Charlie was talking about before. And then I was at Christ Church Whitefish Bay for 5 years before I went off and out of the diocese for about 45 years, and now we're back again in retirement in Milwaukee. But one of the things, some of the memories in terms of maturing, I remember Jack Carlson was one of the older guys in the house, and he also worked at Liz Waters. And he kind of put his arm around us, and remember he took me out to drink for the first time. were a lot of little watering holes on State Street. And what they would, I think David Kent was there, David with, you don't know some of those names, but some of you might. They were clergy in the diocese here at one time. And they would line up these like 3 or 4 different beers. And they would say, well, pick out the one that's a Blatz or a Schlitz or whatever. And I did it every time. What I didn't know is they put a shot of whiskey in the one that I was supposed to pick out. So before the evening was done, I had my first experience of intoxication. And I became good friends in the bathroom up there in the corner of the building that night. It's not a very good memory. I remember another time, Mrs. Otto, who lived in the, between where all of us lived, in the middle floor in her apartment, and a bat somehow got into her apartment. So we were the closest ones that were there. So we came running up with brooms and dustpans, and we're running around, and finally got the bat out of it. I think I had a tennis racket, actually, but we got that critter out of there. The most significant story that I want to share with you is this whole thing about figuring out who I was. And I thought, well, in those days, fraternities had a different sort of, you had a different attitude about what fraternities were. I mean, they're still fine, but in those days, that was kind of the in crowd. And so I decided I would pledge my very first semester. And one of the things that you had to do in those days, I guess you don't do it anymore, but you had to go through rush. And it was awful. You had to wear sackcloth. It was food stuck on you, walk up and down stairs, and it was just really stupid. And I wasn't too bright, so I told my brothers that was really stupid. And it went on for that week or so. And at the end of the time, we went to the inner sanctum of the fraternity house, which was the bar downstairs. And there was a light shining, and all the brothers were there, and they saved me for last. And I went in, I stood there, I was kind of cocky, and they started saying some really awful things about who I was, some of which might have been true. And it was really a really hard time. But it was something that I really needed to hear, I cried, which was really humiliating. And I felt like I don't know what, it was just awful. And so I left that night and I walked around campus. I don't know, maybe for a couple hours. And I ended up in the chapel, in the old chapel, which is now the new chapel. And I prayed, and I was, who am I really? What is my life all about? And it was one of those first experiences of grace, of how often in the desert, those are the times of real transformation in our lives. We have these, usually the mountaintop experiences come after the desert experiences. So I've had a lot of those desert experiences in my life, which have ended up being really important times of transformation. But this was one of the first significant ones in my memory as an adult. And I began to think, what I'm really all about. I really care about the world. I really care about people. I was in engineering. I changed my major 5 times while I was here, trying to figure out, what's this all about. And I thought, I had never thought about priesthood as something that would be appropriate to who I was. It just was way out of bounds. But for some reason that night, that idea occurred to me. And so Father White and I had a conversation about that. And I didn't make any drastic, I remember calling my parents up and said, I've made a big decision. Of course, they were worried that I'd gotten a girl in trouble or something and had to get married. I didn't know what they thought. But anyway, so it didn't take too long. It was between the Peace Corps and going to Nashotah House. The Peace Corps was just starting in those days. And that was a cool thing to do. Well, I was too late to get in. So I went to Nashotah House, which I would have apparently gone to after the Peace Corps had I done that. I ended up in physics. I have a degree in applied mathematics and physics. That was a new program that they began here on campus. And And it's been quite a ride ever since. After being in the diocese here for 10 years, I've been in Canada, where I was actually a bishop as well, the Diocese of Huron, which is a large, and I was the first congregational coach to serve in that capacity. I was in Eau Claire, as Jonathan mentioned, but mostly in Eastern Michigan. I had the privilege of starting a brand new diocese, which was kind of different. We were experimenting with what a diocese should be in this time of history. But I got involved in all that civil rights stuff, big time, in the 60s as a priest, and had a lot of other experiences of growing up in the midst of all of that as well. Anyway, in summary, St. Francis House, the people that were here in leadership or just students, friends, colleagues, have been so important to me and remain important to me, that core of 4 other couples. And this place, this was really a home, a place of prayer, a place of reflection, a place where I could think things through and begin to figure out who I was and where God wanted me to go with my life. So I'm so grateful to this place. 100 years, I can't believe it's been here 100 years. And we were here 57 years ago. Amazing. Great to see you all. I look forward to hearing your stories.